Hey, Nathan.
Hello.
Hey, Brandon.
Hey, Dottie, how's it going today?
It's going well. Too busy lately, too busy.
Definitely feeling that myself.
Hey, I just wanted to check if anyone's on the call. I wasn't sure.
On this call or on a different call?
No, no. It was very quiet, so I was wondering if my microphone or speaker was muted.
Nope, your mic is good. We're just quiet. But it is about time we kick this thing off. I was just taking a second to get the notes updated and wrap up my last meeting because that's the story of our lives, right? One meeting after another. I figured unless someone has something else to talk about, I do have pull request number 6 out there. Dropped it in the meeting notes, but I'll drop it in Slack or Zoom notes as well. PR6 was the Mobi implementation. So I kind of went through that, documented a bunch of it, figured I would show that here, get any feedback on that, and then we can go from there unless someone wants to talk about anything else today. Quiet crowd. No wonder you're wondering about your mic and audio settings, Ajay.
Thanks, Brandon.
Alrighty. Same way, so it's not so close to the mic. And yeah, I did go through a bunch of the Docker process. It involved a bunch of digging to figure out where the heck all this was. So I kind of kept some of my notes at the bottom. I picked a specific tag, and so I went through with the 24.0 tag, or branch, I guess, and found all those. Maybe I should have picked a tag because I think that's a branch. And yeah, so you can see me digging through from method to method to method and all the different other places to come up and say, yep, for sure. And this was not just me looking at the code. I was also comparing registry logs on a little local registry to see that it was really doing this. That the client goes out, pings the V2 API on the registry, gets back the header. Then if it's doing a tag version, token version, it will query the token server with the scope generated on the client. So it kind of ignores anything else on the header, because this header isn't for the individual repo and isn't for the individual action you're doing on the repo. It's just a V2. It's just, can you query the V2 API at all? So the client in this case is actually generating the scope field itself, saying, I'm getting ready to do this kind of action on this repo. Give me a token for that. And the token server gives that back. And then it sends the request with that token to that API. And so I wanted to mention this, bring this up, make sure people can see what I was looking at to do that. And also the more detailed is going through all these steps. It's generating the field according to repository : repo : and the action. The action can be a comma delimited list. I think it is only pull or push, and they just have multiple entries in the scope. If you've got both pull and push the same repo, which maybe you'll make 2 requests, but typically this is going to be separate client actions. So I think you'll see that scope get lost between those. So that's what's happening. And the reason I wanted to bring this up was just to put it out there of saying, this is what a vast majority of clients are doing today. So whatever we do with our implementation, it will probably be good to make sure that we don't break this. Not necessarily saying that we want to explicitly support it, but maybe in terms of saying what the registry responds with, the registry response should probably fall into this model, so that a client that's doing this will still work, but a client that's following whatever OCI is doing would also work. Go ahead, Jeff.
I raised this up internally, and there's a lot of desire to, even though we're currently switching the Docker CLI over to use Containerd instead, which does not do any of this, and it doesn't do any of the V2 ping. I think there's a growing desire to fix the behavior of the current Moby code to not do this anymore either. I think the V2 endpoint is valid. I mean, that's part of the registry spec. That's always going to be there. But there's nothing about it that is useful or would break with any changes to like an auth spec. So I don't know anything we would do would break this flow, but it's definitely not a preferred method.
To give examples of something that could break this flow, we could say that registries could respond to any API call with their own scope value. And it would be registry generated. It would have nothing to do with this format. And if we said that was allowed, then registries can intentionally or unintentionally break all the Moby clients out there today. And potentially a lot of other clients, because most people went back and looked at what was happening with Moby and replicated that same functionality in their own code.
Right, but that's kind of a, I think probably a case of, hey, here's some kind of, because I mean, this right here, this is not per spec. This is not defined by the Docker spec. So like the own Moby thing does not follow the auth spec that is currently on the Docker website, which is somewhat ironic, but is the case. And so like this already, it doesn't match that. Like the spec literally says what you get back from the registry is what you should pass to the auth server. And this does not do that. So yes, if a client wants to try to be cheeky about it, okay, but at the same time, I don't know that any registry is going to like, hey, if we change something, going to like modify what they do. Like if some new registry down the road wants to not do repo, a repo in an action and do that, that's on them and the clients. Yeah, at that point, hopefully the clients have caught up and work with that. But any current one, yes, that definitely will work with that. I mean, all of Containerd doesn't do this. Containerd does it, what I would say is more proper. That actually is used far more than Moby when it comes to at least Docker Hub, just due to usage in Kubernetes and then updated build kit and all the other tools. So I think anything that is currently out there is at least compatible with maybe the more better defined version of the Auth spec. But yeah, definitely we wouldn't want to break anything.
I'm also looking at this as just the first of hopefully several of these. And so I'd like to do one of these for a reg client, and it would be really useful to have someone put that together for Containerd if you or someone else is interested in doing that.
Yeah, I forget, was there a list of which ones we wanted to take a look at?
I didn't have an explicit list, but the reg client would just be because I'm personally familiar with it.
Right.
Be nice to see something for ORAS because I know we've got people that might have some connections over there. Containerd, just because of its popularity, would be good to have in this list. And then I wouldn't mind throwing Cryo or some of the Scopio toolchain in there as well, whatever they've got on their side. And it might just be if you've got some of the statistics on Docker Hub to look and check and see if we're missing anything major, that would also be handy.
Yeah, I mean, I think by and large, Containerd and the Docker one are. I mean, it's a very long tail after that, and a whole bunch of, well, I would say reg client does show up in a not insignificant amount, but there's a long tail of people throwing together custom things as well. So
I'm in that tail, just running my own unit test every 5 minutes. I think that's what is happening. Yeah. Anything we get in there just to kind of sum that up would be good. So in general, is this useful to other people to look at this and see, okay, we understand what's going on? Would it help to reformat this in some way for anybody?
I think it's helpful. I think there's kind of maybe two aspects of this to kind of go off of, because there's kind of, on one hand, there's this is what clients do, and then the other hand is this is what servers offer, or whatever the endpoints the server has. So for instance, like the fact that there's a V2 endpoint is already covered by the registry spec, like by the distribution spec. And so like nothing that we do on the auth side is going to change the fact that there's an endpoint that, if a client chooses to call it, fine. And so it is useful to kind of call out maybe how these different clients work, but that's different from which pieces are necessary from an auth server to offer. Maybe there's a, hey, after we go through a couple of these clients, figure out, yes, this is the endpoint that's useful. By and large, I think most of them do follow the Docker auth spec of hit registry, get back a www authenticate header, pass that to the auth server. There's some variations of, hey, they actually get that from the V2 endpoint before, and then they kind of manually generate it, or they just Containerd does that, but then passes back the raw request that it gets from registry. The basic functionality there is the same as, hey, the auth server has an endpoint that you pass a token to. You hit the registry server to kind of get the information. And so, yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that, other than I think, yeah, it is good to kind of call through a couple limitations, maybe just kind of go through maybe highest usage ones, to make sure that nothing's going to break compatibility, but then kind of do a superset of here's the endpoints that are necessary to perform these actions and which ones are covered by which spec and or what functionality they serve.
Yeah, there was a good call that you made there, that I am focused right now on just the clients. I do think that we want to come back and look at what the servers do. That might be a very different picture, just because servers are going to be not following a specific flow, but they're implementing specific endpoints. And I wonder if it's going to come out that when we look at different clients, we'll come up with a list of, hey, we're hitting this endpoint, we're checking for this header. There are a handful of behaviors that clients are doing, they're looking for. And we might want to list specific things of get on the V2 API. Does a query on directly to a specific API for a manifest key or something like that, return back a valid auth headers along those lines. Building up a list along those lines for the servers as well. And then potentially we might be able to make some kind of compatibility matrix of saying, here's what we have available out there today to work with. Cool. So this is here for folks to have a look at. I'm not sure if people have gone out and done a review yet. So no reviews on this one yet, at least I have seen. Feel free to have a look, see if I missed anything. I did have one comment there asking about the push-pull. That was specifically looking at this more at a theoretical level. And I don't know that I followed any code paths to verify that they did the combination of both. I know it was theoretically possible in the code, but I don't know if anybody actually caught it with that. So I can add both, I can take out both. Doesn't matter to me.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I was going to say, like, at least the way that Docker help is implemented on that, you're only granted what you ask for, kind of thing. But that list is, if it's comma separated, it's split. If you send it as two different scopes, they're merged anyway and treated as one. And so,
and that's what I think the client's doing. I think it's sending two separate scopes, one with a push, one with a pull, and they get merged on the server.
So the end result is you're still sending either one scope with multiple actions or two scopes with one action. I don't know which specific one that the Moby client does, but I know both ways are supported and work the same.
Yeah, and I know that the code is capable of taking an array of actions. I just didn't go digging through everywhere to see if there was any spots in the code that actually did that. And then Nathan, I don't know if you're able to come off mute, because I think you were the one that had the two comments on this. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess for this one, is it just kind of pulling those values out of JSON fields basically in the response, and then one of those fields is just the token. And
that's exactly what it is.
Okay.
There is a JSON syntax that comes back from the server when you request a token. It's got all these fields in there, and JOT would be inside the access token. And so it doesn't parse what's inside of there, but it would pull it back if you gave it to it.
Yeah, I know some of those are in the JOT as well when you break it open. Does the client actually fail if some of those are missing, or any of those, or does it just ignore it?
A bunch of these fields, when it was doing that, it was looking at, had specific fallbacks for specific places. So for example, if you didn't have the access token defined, well, you're kind of in trouble. The refresh token, I think if it didn't see that, it's just going to keep sending new requests whenever it needs to. The expires in issued at will default to the current time if you didn't set it. expires in will default to 60 seconds if you either don't define it or it's less than that. Scope, I don't think it even looked at. But this was, both of these were sending similar stuff, and then it would just parse it apart as a JSON body.
Sure.
One of them was a form with a bunch of values. The other one was query parameters on the URL itself, which I don't like, but that's what they do. Anything else folks like to dig into on this one, or switch to other topics, or quick wrap up if we don't have anything else?
I think that looks good, so we can switch to something else.
I'm seeing several of us all looking for Containerd. Do we have any volunteers to do Containerd? I'm looking for this not to be a solely Brandon effort.
I could take a look at Containerd this week.
Oh, thanks. Sajay and Toddy, do you know anybody that wants to work on something like ORS on your side?
I can check. You have put the Mobi PR, so it might help them to kind of like start seeing if we can put in the docs there. I'll reach out to Shuei. They're in Shanghai time. That's the only problem.
That'd be awesome. Thank
They're
you.
actually out this and next week. So Sajay, they're at KubeCon this week.
Yeah.
And next week is holidays. So I don't know whether they'll be able to make any progress in that.
No, I don't
It's-
think so.
I'm not putting a timeline on it. I just want to put a name on it so that when they do get some time to work on it, we've got somebody to ping later on.
Yeah, if we kind of target 3 or 4 weeks from now.
We're a relatively slow moving working group right now, so I think that works.
Yeah, they also partition the credential library in ORS. And so it might be easier for whoever's owner of that library to probably take a look at this and put that in place.
Awesome. I think the only thing we need to track down later on might be some of the Red Hat versions of these, but I'm going to say that for
Yeah,
another day.
Scopia would be another one, right? Scopia and
Yeah.
Rodman has their own.
Yeah, I think they all call their own containers library, but I'd have to, that's either some digging or some pinging of other people that might be interested in helping out over there.
Thanks, Brandon. I think this is a great start. I'm more curious in the sense of, do we care about how how distribution implements the API server, because it has a built-in API server or something that we can use, right? So, or
Are you asking the server-side version of this?
I mean, the point is, I guess it goes hand in hand, right? Like you need the client spec and you need how servers might interpret this also.
Yeah, and the client spec is indifferent of which server it's talking to, so hopefully that doesn't matter.
Right.
But yeah, I agree that we do need to get the servers in there. I was just pushing it off to a little bit later until we have multiple clients and have an idea
Agreed.
of what kinds of requests clients are sending, to start knowing what to look for in each of the servers to see, does the server implement this API? And my hope is we can turn that into some kind of compatibility matrix. And by that, I'm thinking.
Sorry, one question. Have you called out how these tokens actually get shared within scope of registry and things like that? Because that's something that people expect, right? Like within the same, like, okay. The token cache is actually shared by the DNS, right? In Mobi.
It would take some more digging to know if it is per client connection or not. Because at the very least, on the Mobi side, the client connects to the backend Docker engine, and it sends all the credentials the client has. So if you have two different users, those two different users can have different logins to the same registry server. And so it is very possible that it completely forgets all of its tokens as soon as that client disconnects. And the next client that it's talking to would have its own set of credentials that it's passing around.
Okay, so that's an area that we have hit some trouble with. For example, we assume that docker.io is the default, and you have some amount of state that's shared between, depending on what the domain resolves to, and clients keep this cache around. So what is the scope of the credential might be interesting to at least call out, right? Like, is there a notion of, basically, should I talk to a different repository with a different credential is the question I'm trying to answer. I mean, I know I kind of have a hint of it, but the spec never calls out, like, how does a client determine what's the scope that it needs to send to? For example, when you go to Docker library, you can go with an anonymous token, but if you go to my private repository, that's not going to work.
I can talk about those a lot better in the context of Reg client. I'm not able to talk about it as well on the Mobi side, but
on the Mobi side, it matches off of hostname. That's kind of an issue already. So anytime that you do any registry interaction with, say, index.docker.io, any credentials that has locally in the credential store are sent. It doesn't matter if it's a public image, it doesn't matter if it's a private image, anything that goes to that registry, it attaches the credentials that it has locally for that endpoint. And then same for if you're doing for ECR, if you're doing for Azure, if you're doing for whatever it may be, it does a domain name mapping.
So that host name, yeah, and that host name is how many clients are pivoting off. So that's why I wanted to kind of like call it out somewhere, that even if you have scopes that are like, your scope is probably going to be used across calls, provided if it's the same host name somehow, right? Does it make sense what I'm asking? I'm just trying to kind of like clarify here.
So I will say potentially, because Jeff's right, it's by the host name, but across calls gets to be an interesting concept in Docker, because you are going to have one client connecting into the backend server saying, let me pull an image, here are my credentials to try to do that task. And it will look up and find, okay, here's the Docker Hub credential because I'm pulling from there, and use that to talk to the server, do the pull request with. So I see some wiggling on Jeff's side. So am I.
In the context of the way that Mobi client works with Docker Hub specifically, there is no real concept of reusing that. Every time, if you do a specific Docker pull, it will hit the registry to figure out what it needs access to. It will, do basically an HTTP round trip or a transport hook in there, go out, get the credentials from the auth server, go back, use those credentials against registry, do that action. If you do another Docker pull, or if you do a different image, or you do like every one of those actions will go out and get a new token.
Right, but the access to, the refresh token that it sends back is bound to the host type, the host name, right?
The refresh token is literally the exact same thing as the access token. It's meaningless and can't be used for anything. It was put in there to basically satisfy the fact that a field needs to be there, name that to make OAuth happy. But you can't resend that field. You can't redo that. It's literally the same as the access token. In the case of
it would require that your previous token had expired and it had to re-trigger the auth, but that would only happen if you were doing some ridiculously long push and maybe it hit some blob 5 minutes later and the token was only valid for 1 minute. It's just not going to do the kinds of things you're thinking of, Sajay, just because it is specific to each individual action, and then it starts all over from the beginning for each next action. But that's also where I think if I describe what Reg Client does, that might answer some of the things you're thinking about, Sajay, and might open up a whole new set of questions, because I am looking at much more longer term credentials. I am looking at using that refresh token. maybe other registries that did the same. And that might get us some more interesting use cases there as well, in terms of when someone has a long-lived client and these things are expiring after a time, and you've got multiple clients and they're doing different actions in different repositories, trying to use the same tokens around, it gets a little bit more interesting.
Right. I'm aware that credential caching is probably out of scope, but the question still remains, like when I go to a repository, which set of username password or which set of credentials do I actually take? Whether it's to get the refresh token or the access token. That's kind of what I'm trying to get to.
If you are connecting to it for the first time and you have a refresh token from before, you can use that. That would be associated with your user login though. So you don't want to have a different user using the refresh token from someone else, depending on how your tool is written.
Okay, just a crazy thought. Can I do a username password per repository or a set of repositories?
Not in Docker. It's per registry.
Right. So you're kind of alluding to the answer, which is your host name is what is binding that credential set, right?
Yes. Every login is per registry. If you do another login to the same registry, that overwrites the previous login.
But that's CLI tool specific. Like that's not Auth related. That's not, I mean, Auth wise, if you had a smart tool that store those credentials per repository or whatever, you could write that. That's not specific to the Auth spec itself. The Auth spec itself just says you must have a token that's scoped to this to do these actions on the registry. So if you had a CLI that did categorize and say, hey, these repositories use this username and password, these repositories use this username and password, and you interact on the same registry with that, and your client was smart enough to, you know, when I'm doing actions on this repo, use these creds, when I'm using action on these repos, use these credentials, you can do that, just not within the Moby CLI as it is today.
Makes sense.
Yeah. My way of working around that in Reg Client has been to allow multiple references for a registry name, and the registry name has a backend of whatever the host is. And so you can have multiple registry names going to the same host name, and each registry name would have its own login. It's easier to show if I'm actually showing an example out there, but effectively I can log into the same registry multiple times just by giving it a different pseudo name that I would call it within my commands. That's a way around it. Being able to log into individual repos would be another interesting way around it. I'm curious on the use cases you're thinking of, Sajay. Do you have users that want to have multiple logins to something like Azure?
It's mixed. It's basically, we have a registry that is anonymous for most cases, but we have authentication for some cases. And when they put the credentials in, the scope determines, right? Like to some extent, if there are certain images that can be accessed, what is the credential they should be using? That's kind of the, how do you unify this on the client side? That's kind of what I'm trying to get to, right? Like we have OB, we have CRI, different places have a different set of credentials. And how do we tell that for this scope, this is the credential that we want to use? I think it's a mix of anonymous plus authenticated repositories that I'm kind of coming from.
If you are a user, you have a credential. Would you want to access something anonymously without giving it your credential? Is there like a use case?
So then I'll get to the specific challenge that we had. We were actually accessing a set. This is not with respect to the registry, but generally a general security issue. When we are going to a backend upstream, the blob technically is anonymous. Like there's no reason for it to have a credential, but it was sending the wrong credential. It was sending a JOT that was signed with a different scope. And so the server would reject it, saying that I don't understand this because you sent me a credential. I'm trying to see what's the general pattern for
I have a Docker login, but it's expired, but the repository is anonymous. Should I actually give you the response back or not? That's kind of what I'm trying to get to.
That's something I would love to have this working group work through myself, because my workaround on that specific issue has been a switch inside of my authentication that says the authentication is specific to each repo. And I had to put that for some registry servers, that if I tried to log into 3 or 4 repositories at once and then try to now push something to the 5th repository, it wouldn't give me back. It would tell me denied. It wouldn't say, please go get an updated credential. And that's something I think would be useful for us to work through the different implications of what it means for a client that is reusing the same credential from before that tries to now talk to yet another repo.
Right. And Jeff, I agree with you. This might not be in scope of the specification, and I'm okay if we say that we don't document this, but this problem has come across. So I'm okay even if we just talk about it and have issues that kind of like keep the discussion somewhere.
I think it's not in scope for the Moby client because they don't have this challenge the way they've implemented things on their side. Maybe for Containerd, depending on how they do things. But for you and I, Sajay, I think it's more interesting. And so it would make sense for us to talk about what a good implementation looks like.
I mean, I don't want to say it's not in scope, but I mean, it does sound like it's an interesting use case. I'm just saying the underlying API endpoints behind granting scopes and granting access, I think, cover it. It's the implementation of the client itself that needs to be written in such a way to kind of handle this use case. I think the underlying server can support it, the client doesn't.
Server can support it, but different servers support it different ways because there are not a lot of people that do it. So they haven't seen it. And so whenever I chime in and say, hey, I'm trying this, they come back to me and say, why the heck are you doing it that way? I'm like, well, the spec didn't tell me I couldn't do it. They don't like that answer.
I'll probably write this down. Basically, incorrect credentials on an anonymous repository is the concrete scenario that I can think of. I'll create an issue and we can take from there.
Yeah, the way I would look at it is, can you take a token that gives you access to one repository, use that for a completely different request to a different repository, and get back the proper response from the registry server of saying not that you're refused, but that you need to go back and get a new credential that gives you access to this repository.
So you want a 403 right at that point? Like basically you're authenticated, but you're not authorized.
No, I think I wanted to say that you have not authenticated. I think I want the 401 that says you have not done the authentication to this repository. And that has an interesting challenge for, can that easily be implemented with what we're looking at today? Because they don't necessarily have that detail within the token itself to know that you made that request. And it may come back and say clients don't do that. That might be the answer we come up with.
Yeah. All right.
But yeah, I ended up making a switch on Reg client that selectively you can enable or disable. And so I point out the registries that I had to enable this on. For each repository, treat the authentication as unique. And so it won't try to ever reuse any token between it. And it will always get a new fresh token just for an individual repository. Which makes the concept of a cross-repository blob mount interesting because you just never have a token for both in that case. Cool. Anything else people want to talk about today? So we have action items for Containerd, myself on Reg client, and Sajay, are you going to take the action to ping the team overseas?
Yeah,
for
I'll
us?
do that.
Cool.
Thank you.
And we can come back next week and see who made progress. I'm guessing it'll be me. I don't want to rush Nathan too much on Containerd.
Yeah, I obviously have copious free time, so as we always say.
This is my rare week that I do actually have a little bit of free time, although I shouldn't say that too much. Oh, I need to correct myself. Next week I won't be here. It's DockerCon next week, so I won't be able to help out on that one. We will see where we're at next week in that case. All right. On that note, let me give you back a couple minutes here of your day. Get back some of that free time to work on your next meeting. And we will sync back up next week or the week after, depending on who's going to be here. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Brandon. See you, folks.